Hi, I'm Vince, aka Vince in the Bay, and I am in the Bay with Bright Talk live at RSA. We're at Moscone Center, and I'm joined now by Rami.
Hi.
How's it going, Rami?
Going great. How are you?
Good. How's your RSA experience been so far?
So far, so good. It's the best
Yeah.
RSA I've been in.
Really? How many
Yeah.
have you been to?
I think it's the fifth.
Wow. Okay, cool. So what brings you here? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing here at RSA this year.
Sure. So I'm co-founder and CEO of a company called WhiteSource, and we do security for open source components for, I think, 8 years now. And we come here to meet people, to make ourselves more known, and to expose ourselves to the industry and to people who are visiting the event.
And what does WhiteSource do exactly?
So we help software engineering teams keep track on their open source usage and then provide them with feedback about various potential issues that those components may have, mostly security, but also around licensing and quality and other types of issues.
Now, I've noticed in the last year or so that a lot of big enterprises are embracing open source projects like Hewlett Packard, Microsoft. Are you working with clients like that?
Yes, so in fact both of those.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah, and many others. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, we see a huge uptake in enterprise adoption of open source, and then they start to also understand they need tools around it and to help themselves manage it in a more proper manner now that they are consuming so much open source.
Now, why are these companies moving towards open source now? What's the advantage of that?
So it's really a grassroots kind of motion.
Yeah.
All of their engineers are using open source. You cannot realistically produce software today, commercial software, without using a lot of open source. You don't want to be reinventing the wheel for every simple feature you need. These things have already been well established and tested and are working extremely well everywhere. So it's very convenient to just grab them and get the feature you need and move on to the things that you are really good at, to your core competence, and invest all of your resources there.
Now, what would you say to somebody who thinks that it's a bad idea for these companies to move to open sourcing? Because a lot of this stuff can be replicated, exploited. I believe the Equifax breach was due in part to Apache Struts, which is
Right.
open source. Why do you think they should embrace this technology?
Look, so that ship has already sailed, right? The battle has been won.
Uh-huh.
I don't think you can resist that tidal wave. You won't be able to get engineers to work for you, and they will not be productive unless you let them work with open source, which is the very normal way in which software gets developed today. So you really cannot stop that motion from going and accelerating. In terms of security, you can never be 100% secure. No one is bulletproof, and there's actually a big chance that if you insist on developing everything yourself, you will do a worse job than the people who produce open source for you, just on the fact that there are so many of them. Right? There are millions and millions of people contributing to open source projects, and you can benefit from all of that work. And if you have to produce it yourself, you have limited resources, no matter how big you are, you will never get there.
But what are some of the risks that are introduced with that? I mean, there's advantages. There's got to be some disadvantages.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So security is very different between proprietary code and when you develop your own software versus when you take someone else's code, primarily around the fact that vulnerabilities and problems with open source are publicly known. right? If there is a problem or a vulnerability being reported in an open source component, then everyone gets to know about it, hackers know about it and then try to exploit it. Versus if you have a bug in your own system, usually no one outside your organization knows about it. And so dealing with these two kinds of risks require different kinds of approaches, policies, and tools. But it doesn't mean that open source is less safe. It's just different.
Yeah, and I guess this also, with open source, it becomes a question of who controls the ownership of this code. Especially if it sort of originates in one form and then gets permutated elsewhere. Like, is there any
Right.
like advantage or disadvantage to that? Like, is there problems with ownership, and if there is an incident that happens, like such as Equifax or something? I mean, in Equifax's case, they probably should have patched this known vulnerability that was out there, but
Right.
still, who could ultimately take responsibility for some of this open source code that has an issue in it if it's not technically really owned by anybody?
Right. So you
And it's
kind
cobbled
of
together by
right.
different
Yeah,
people.
it's a good point. You're kind of touching on a broader philosophical question here
Yeah.
of ownership, and really open source isn't owned in the classical way that you think about owning stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because a company that, even Equifax or any company that's taking open source components from the web and embeds them into their software and then ships that software to their customers or just provide services based on it, is accountable to those open source components, but they don't own them, right? They don't own them in the sense that they cannot prevent anyone else from using them, which is what ownership usually means. So there is like a distinction here between ownership and accountability, right? A company that takes open source components and makes it part of their software is accountable. Like if something goes wrong with it, their customers will come to them for a solution. They cannot turn around and blame some, amorphous community that produced that open source. But they don't have the advantage of owning it. So it's kind of a mixed position here.
So you mentioned that you work with Microsoft and Hewlett Packard and other, I'm sure, lots of other big name companies. Are there any big entities that are reluctant to embrace open source?
So there used to be, we don't meet those anymore. Like a few years ago, I would say about a decade ago, you'd still see large organizations push back against open source and try to enforce policies that will not allow their developers to consume and use open source. But I think those walls have been torn down since over the last few years. And I really don't know. Also, some government organizations used to oppose it, but now all the policies have changed and people not only would allow open source, but start to contribute to open source, start to embrace it, start to talk about how good it is for business, why their engineers should contribute to the community. So it's kind of 180 degrees towards where it was, I would say, around a decade ago.
Okay, so for some of these businesses that are thinking about switching to open sourcing, what are some what's some advice you'd give them on how to start? Like, just open a GitHub account and just start going, or how does it work?
That's
How do you
one way
implement it?
to go about it. But first off, you should start using what other people have already done for you in open source. It's
Yeah.
very easy. It's abundant. You can find it very easily. Start with a functionality that you want to implement. Search online for advice on which is the best or which is best for you, right? What fits your specific needs and environments, and start doing some sandboxing. Do some, contained POC environment and play around with it. Get yourself familiarized with it. See that it does, in fact, meet your requirements and does the kind of function you need it to do, and then take it from there. When you start get comfortable enough to put it in your production, then take that step.
Okay, so when these developers share code and borrow code or whatever, use this open source code. What are some common mistakes that they use in implementing somebody else's code into something that they're working on? Like, what are some pitfalls? What are some things they should look out for?
Right, so one of the first things you have to keep in mind is that open source, any open source component you take, is a piece of software in its own right, and has its open source dependencies. So you're basically, when you're taking a component, you are dragging a whole tree of transitive dependencies behind it, right? It goes on, because this component is dependent on that one, which is dependent on another one, and so on. So you should watch out for that. Like, you should be very aware that you're taking one, but you're actually bringing in a whole bunch of them under the hood, and you have to be mindful of that, and at least keep track of that part. You should also keep in mind that these are great, right? It saves a lot of work and does a lot of things for you, but it does come with some strings attached, right? You should be aware that they may have some bugs, they may have issues, they may have license requirements. Like, it's still free, but the license can require you to take some steps in order to adhere to it. And so you should monitor for that and keep track. And then lastly, I would say, is you have to keep doing that over time, right? Because open source is something that keeps changing. New versions go out with new capabilities sometimes, improvements, performance enhancements, and so on. So it's worthwhile to track that, over a year, 2 years, whatever. Don't let this become some legacy piece of your software. Keep it up to date. Make sure you're using the newer versions and enjoying all the benefits of all the new work that's being done in the community.
So it feels like, now that bigger enterprises are embracing all this, and that seems to be kind of like a new trend. What do you think in the next 5 years the new trends will be in open source?
So I think we're already seeing most of what I would expect to be the big trends, and that's open source is to some extent consolidating within itself. You see more and more bigger projects which are very well maintained and have a strong monitoring around its security and quality. They get backing from large corporations and some funding sometimes, which helps them maintain a high grade of their projects. I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see more tooling and automation around that to help you consume open source more easily, to help you maintain a high level of open source usage over time, as well as around security. That's a hot topic right now, where you see a big rise in awareness for security issues in open source. So that's something that's already starting to happen, is people are testing their open source for security issues, doing that continuously, making sure they're not pushing vulnerabilities into their production. So I think we'll see more of that.
And so what is WhiteSource doing to help organizations really optimize the use of open source?
Right, so we give a set of dedicated tools just for that problem. Right, our whole mission in life is to help these organizations track and manage their use of open source, and we have a broad set of tools that very easily can integrate into a wide variety of environments, development environments and development tools, and then automatically understand all of the open source components being used and provide feedback on them, dashboards, reports, policy management, workflow management, including all the security related features, alerts and reports for security, some prevention capabilities to block potentially problematic components from ever entering your environments, some remediation capabilities. When you already have a vulnerable component, we will help fix it for you, or at least give you some advice on what you should do to fix it. So that's our main focus today, and we keep rolling out more and more capabilities in that area.
So you really like open source?
I love it, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you don't like about it? Is there anything that is a drag that you find is frustrating? Anything about it that frustrates you?
No, not immensely. It's
oh, come on!
great.
There's got to be something that
It's
is,
not.
is kind of annoying about
So
it?
look, there's like the big advantage of it that it's unmanaged, unstructured, right? There's this whole notion of the bazaar versus the cathedral, where commercial hierarchical organizations are the cathedral and they have very managed processes for producing software, whereas open source is the bazaar. There is no centralized control. Anyone can do what they want, which is great, but is also a bit messy.
Yeah, it
And
sounds to me like controlled chaos in some ways.
right, or uncontrolled chaos, right? So in that respect, it's sometimes hard to figure out, what the right open source project to use is, what's best suited for me, how would I even go about comparing different alternatives, because it's such a mess. Those activities are harder to accomplish. So I would say maybe that's the next big thing to tackle with open source.
Since I've been here at RSA, one of the big things that people keep buzzing about, and just in general in the tech industry, people have been buzzing about is integrating AI into technology, into security. How does AI fit into open source? Is there anything unique about open source that can complement the use of AI?
I don't know if it's unique, but you do see more and more open source projects around AI.
Yeah,
Google is a big contributor to that.
What was that?
Google contributes
Google,
a lot,
okay.
yeah. Different projects around AI and enabling AI for free, right? You can pick open source projects that do that and then save yourself a lot of the trouble of implementing the more complex and advanced algorithmics around
Right.
AI. So that's a big plus. So the marriage here between AI and open source does really open it up to a very broad public and makes it very easy to implement and use.
And what's on the horizon for WhiteSource? What sort of projects do you have coming down the line?
So our main focus really now is to help our customers prioritize the security issues. Because as I'd mentioned before, you can never achieve 100% safety, right? You always compromise on something. So we think it's very important to help our customers find the specific vulnerabilities that have the most exposure to them specifically and that have the largest effect on them and can potentially become breaches. So that's something we're investing a lot of R&D in, developing tools that are enabling our users to find in the list of the vulnerabilities that they have in their product, the ones that are really impacting them the most, and then fix those first and sort of do a 20/80 kind of investment where they invest very little and get a big reward very quickly. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruits there that can help improve your security standing very, very quickly.
Okay, I think you've mentioned a few of these already, but what are some examples of open source projects that you think have been very successful out in the real world?
All right, so in recent years, we see an explosion of various NPM projects. NPM itself.
What's that?
NPM, Node Package Management,
Uh-huh.
has been enormously successful in the last few years. And then within that realm, you see the big, I think mostly UI projects like Angular come out and become this enormous phenomenon. So I think those are where you see the bigger ones come out in the community.
Great. Anything else you want to share about open source that we haven't covered?
I think we covered the important parts.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for helping educate me a little bit more about open source. I don't think I've said the word open source this many times in the course of 15 or 20 minutes.
Right.
So you've definitely raised my awareness, and I appreciate it. And hopefully you've helped educate some of the folks that are tuning in. So
Okay,
thank you
great.
very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for tuning in to Bright Talk at RSA 2019, and we'll see you next time.
you.